back. Thanks for joining with us. We appreciate your attendance with us today. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our second segment. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host. In this segment, we want to talk about the court ruling that probable cause and a warrant are required in order for law enforcement to use a GPS tracking device, on your vehicle. There's an article out in Wired magazine. I'll incorporate this into the bottom of the comment section on the YouTube, and it's up on our Facebook and Facebook page and website. And the court has ruled that in order to utilize a GPS tracking device that in many cases is surreptitiously attached to your vehicle, the law enforcement agency has to have a probable cause warrant issued by a judge in order to do that. Now, the Supreme Court heard this case going back a few years. I think it was, or actually last year in 2012. But they left this wide open loophole that you could drive 7 tractors trailers through abreast. The courts since then, court after court after court, in all of the federal circuits have been going back and forth about whether or not the issue requires a probable cause warrant to affix GPS. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals has finally come out and said, yes, you must, and it was a 2-1 decision. Now, that doesn't mean that, and for the record, if you don't understand the federal court system, it's kind of onerous. The circuits, and the way circuits work, by the way, is they cover a specific geographic area. So, as an example, the circuit courts that are in the circuit court of the 7th Circuit, right, or the 7th District, covers Illinois and Wisconsin and Indiana. The 8th District is Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. The 9th Circuit covers California. It covers Washington, Oregon, Alaska. I think it's Arizona, and I think it covers Idaho and Montana and some other places. The 9th, by the way, is known as the Wacky Circuit. They're the ones who come out with all these crazy cockamamie decisions that nobody in their right mind can legitimately justify, right? So anyway, the point is that once a circuit makes a ruling, it doesn't necessarily apply to other circuits. So there's 2 aspects to this. One, it's a win for citizens, and it's a win for the American people, because GPS and tracking have become, quite frankly, almost commonplace in law enforcement. And then their argument is, well, we'll wait for the courts to sort it out, but at least we have the opportunity to nab the suspect that we want and use the information to charge him. And, hopefully we'll win. Well, the ACLU came out the other day and said, today's decision is a victory for all Americans because it ensures that the police cannot use powerful tracking technology without court supervision, and a good reason to believe it will turn up evidence of wrongdoing as a result, in other words, of using GPS. These protections are important because where people go reveals a great deal about them, from who their friends are to where they visit, the doctor, and where they choose to worship. And all of those things are true. This case is a follow-up to a case which was heard by the Supreme Court on a convicted drug dealer. And the police used GPS to track this guy and prove that he was a drug dealer. In that case, the Supreme Court justices ruled that law enforcement installation of a GPS device on a target's vehicle constituted a search under the Fourth Amendment. However, at that time, they declined to rule on whether a search was unreasonable and therefore required a warrant. Now, with all due respect, that's inexcusable behavior on the part of the Supreme Court. When you're going to rule on an issue, you rule on the whole thing. You don't sit there and rule on little micro pieces of it and then leave these gaping holes that are big enough for you to drive Rhode Island through. I mean, the decorum of the court and all of that kind of hoopla nonsense. Listen, if people have gone to the extent and the trouble and the expense of getting to the Supreme Court to solve an issue that is ripe for controversy, and that's a court term, well, then you have an obligation, SCOTUS, that's Supreme Court of the United States. You have an obligation, SCOTUS, to rule on the entire thing, not just on one little micro element of the case. Anyway, they did, and that's how they normally rule, so don't expect it to change just because I think it ought to change. But the truth of the matter is that they ruled that, yes, it was a Fourth Amendment, it was a search under the Fourth Amendment, but they didn't determine whether that search was reasonable or unreasonable, which was like, what's the point then? All of these courts since then have been going back and forth and trying to decide whether or not GPS trackers are legitimate, and utilizing the Supreme Court decision, which is supposed to, trickle down to every other court below, as to whether or not how they interpret it based on that decision from the Supreme Court. Well, here's the problem. All these circuits have differing answers to it. Some say it is, some say it isn't. And to make matters worse, many of them were saying, well, it was pre the Supreme Court ruling, so therefore it should stand. And they're convicting people based on the fact that, the Supreme Court may have changed the rules, but as long as they were operating in good faith under the old rules before the Supreme Court decision, we have to still convict these people. I mean, it's amazing to me how far law enforcement will go in order to damage the nation. I mean, look, I get that there are legitimate needs for law enforcement, but I got to tell you, the problem with our justice system is that it is based almost exclusively on injustice. There was an article I read this morning about a judge in Texas who resigned yesterday. And he resigned because, and he didn't reference this in his resignation, but this is why he resigned. The evidence is now out that back when he was a prosecutor in the 80s, he withheld evidence in a case where a guy was accused of murdering his wife. And he withheld evidence from his own 3-year-old, from the guy, the man's 3-year-old son who witnessed the mother being killed by home invaders. And the 3-year-old said, it wasn't daddy. Well, the guy held that evidence back from the jury. And then the other area that he held back was that witnesses had seen a vehicle parked and people entering the woods and so forth and so on. And so anyway, this guy was released after some 20, 30 years in prison, of wrongful imprisonment, I might add. And since then, they did find the right guy, and he's been charged and convicted, and he's now in prison. Well, this guy who was a judge at the time, he was a prosecutor, and he withheld that information. And I got to tell you, America, the nation is loaded with those kinds of cases. I actually helped an attorney on a case here in Missouri that is now in front of the Missouri Supreme Court, where the exact same scenario happened. The prosecutor threatened a witness and insisted, and this kid was a juvenile, he was 15 at the time, and he threatened a witness and said, if you testify on behalf of this kid who was 15, and they gave him a life sentence without parole, if you testify on behalf of this kid, then I'm going to get word out into the prison system that you're a rat and you will be killed before you finish your sentence. He also withheld evidence. This guy who was going to testify on behalf of the kid, he had been, the guy who really committed the murder had confessed to him. And this guy knew so much that he was able to tell prosecutors where to go find evidence, bloody clothes, in the case. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, you have no idea how corrupt this system is, and how prosecutors and judges will turn a blind eye to exculpatory evidence that will release and reveal the truth and release, wrongly convicted people. You know what? I used to be for the death penalty. before I had any involvement with the legal system and or knowledge or experience with it. Because I was under the impression that law and order was the right thing to do. But I got to tell you something. The number of people that are in prison that have been railroaded into prison by dirty prosecutors and dirty judges and dirty lawyers, by the way, who actually work for both sides while taking the money from the defendant, it is so outrageous. It is so high that we no longer have a sense of justice in this country. There is no justice here. And I cannot, in good conscience, know that a guy is being put to death for a crime which, in many cases, it's about a 30% or 40% chance he didn't even commit it. The Innocence Project is a group out there who takes on cases in death row only, and they force the prisons to do DNA testing, which, back in the 70s and the 80s, DNA testing wasn't even available, much less accurate. They are freeing people from death row and life without parole sentences on such a staggering rate. I mean, we're talking hundreds of people so far, which tells me that, and then as it comes out, we find out that, the prosecutor threatened this person and cajoled this witness or coerced a witness. I'm telling you, it is so dirty. There is no sense of true justice in the United States of America. And so when I hear about court cases and I hear the way in which they utilize information and they lie on the stand or they twist things around to be used have a different meaning than they actually do, to me this is a perfect example. They use GPS as a means to be able to gather information that they know they're not allowed to get under the Fourth Amendment and under the Constitution, and then use that to convict someone. But yet, how much of it is wrongful convictions? In this case, the court, this Third Circuit Court, ruled that well, I'll read it to you. Although the Third Circuit Court, where the current case was heard, did not have such a ruling in place prior to the Supreme Court decision. In other words, they had not had a case that they had to rule on whether GPS was a warrantless use or not. The government argued that investigators in this recent case were operating under good faith based on prior rulings in other districts. So you see, what the courts do is they say, well, since we haven't had a case like this in our district, we can rely on the ruling from the 7th or the 8th or the 10th or the 11th or the 12th or the 1st district. The problem with that, of course, is that it's using precedent in law. And I can do an entire day of education about the problem and the harm of precedent, because the precedents that they use are not applicable to your case. In other words, no one's case ever gets heard on the merits of that case. The rulings are made based on the precedent of another case that was beneficial to the argument of the prosecution in a prior case. With all due respect, how is it that you can allow precedent to stand and take control of a case when the circumstances of that case weren't related to the circumstances of this case? But courts want to save time and money, and they don't want to investigate every case and look at it on its own constitutional basis. So they say, well, courts in this circuit have ruled that way, so therefore we're going to rule that way. Wow. In any case, here's the long and the short of it. There's two sides to this. This is a win for America in the sense that now, and I'm not sure, this will probably end up going back to the Supreme Court at some point, but now defendants will at least have the ability to point and say, look, the Third Circuit said that it is a Fourth Amendment ruling and it's an appellate court ruling, which means that it has precedence over some of these other lower court rules. And then the other aspect to this, which is not good, is that this does not address the NSA using your personal tracking device or tracking you on the internet. And this is a GPS tracking device, ladies and gentlemen. Make no mistake about it. This device here has a GPS chip in it. Every phone does by law. And you can't turn it off. And if you think for one moment that they are not utilizing, one, the GPS tracking capabilities of that phone to track you, and it's part of the metadata that the NSA collects, you're wrong. And when they cannot get a GPS coordinate, they can still get you by triangulation, by capturing the 2 or 3 towers that you're communicating with, and they can pretty much triangulate your position down to a few 100 yards, maybe a quarter of a mile. Which means that they can track you where you go. They can track where you work, where you go to church, where you go to school, where you visit, the places where you visit frequently, and they can build a profile on you, just like law enforcement can. The problem is that what we now have in the United States of America is a police state. I've said this repeatedly. This is a place now where you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. Law enforcement, the courts have all of the power and all the preferential treatment of their argument on their side. You, on the other hand, when you are charged with a crime, you have to prove that you are innocent, and furthermore, you have to prove yourself innocent despite the fact that, they beat you by financial attrition, because you can't hire the level of legals. Most people cannot afford a federal court case. Most people can't afford a state court criminal case, much less a federal case. With the difference between a state case is, an attorney might charge you $5,000 for a defense in a state case. That same exact case on a federal level, and they will not even talk to you for less than $50,000. So what that tells you is that they're beating you not because you're guilty and they're right, but because they're beating you via financial attrition, because you can't afford to defend yourself. And then they throw this plea deal in front of you that says, well, look, if you sign off on this and you rat out 2 or 3 people, we'll cut your sentence down from 10 years to 6, or from 5 years down to 2. It's a game. This is good news for Americans, but it's bad news for Americans. It's good news for Americans because we now can utilize this as a legitimate argument against the slap-on GPS type tracking that law enforcement's been doing. The bad side of this is it exposes the open truth that law enforcement is not above descending to breaking the law to find you guilty of something which, quite frankly, may or may not be a crime. Part of our goal at America's Voice Now, and part of my personal mission, is to educate and inform, to motivate and activate you. Hopefully, those of you who take an interest in law, or, some people, when you mention law, they just fog over, right? But if you have an interest in this, become a subject matter expert on law. You don't have to be a law professor, but learn about it, educate yourself about it, and then take action in that area where you have influence, or you have power, or you have authority, or you can make a difference. You can fight back on many, many, numerous levels. You can fight back by calling your representative and your congressman, but we all know that that's, for all intents and purposes, a de facto waste of time. But if you're in the legal industry, if you are in a position where you're in law enforcement, you can make a difference. You can make a difference by, one, acting constitutionally if you're in law enforcement. Stop prosecuting people for stuff that you know is not a crime. You can make a difference if you are called to sit on a jury. I got to tell you, folks, if you're called to sit on a jury and you do not do that jury duty, you have just abandoned your nation. Your obligation is to sit there and say, I can make a difference here. If I find a law to be unconstitutional on its face, I can reject that and say, I'm not going to find this guy guilty in a grand jury indictment. Or I'm going to be the 1 out of the 12 that says, not guilty, and I'm not budging. You can sit here and you can throw all the evidence you want at me, but I'm convinced that this guy is not guilty, and that's it. Do your duty. Be a part. Play a role. Be an active participant in our republic. The reason we're in the condition we're in as a nation is because everybody has abdicated all level of responsibility to the nebulous they. Stop waiting for others to determine your fate. If you like the law, if the idea of reading a court case so that you can gain some information and intelligence and formulate logical, reasoned opinions, then please, by all means, start educating yourself. There's a link here to the actual ruling by the court. I don't know, it's like 4 pages or something like that. Read it. Educate yourself about it. Understand what they're talking about. I get it, it's legalese. If you have a talent for reading legalese, man, do us all a favor and become an activist in that regard. Get a hold of FIJA, FIJA.org, Fully Informed Jury Association. Every one of you, whether you take an interest in law or not, should be on the Fully Informed Jury Association. Read every word that you can find. Because when you're called for jury duty, whether it's a grand jury or actual jury duty during a trial, you have an obligation to do the right thing as a participating, functioning member of this republic. FIJA, Fully Informed Jury Association.org. Get over there. I've interviewed her, the director over there, on America's Voice Now, and I have to tell you, it was one of the most startling and eye-opening interviews we did. In fact, I'll probably try to get her back on again. Once we get to our video studio, I'll actually try to get her on with a Skype program. But I tell you, get yourself involved. Stop sitting back waiting for someone else to ride up on a shining white steed in glittering armor. That's never gonna happen. It's up to you. It's up to me. Every one of us are individual leaders in some microcosmic area. Do your part, play a role, be a part of it. You've been listening to America's Voice Now. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to tackle our third subject, the IMF, International Monetary Fund's global plan to siphon the wealth away from the planet. When you hear this one, you guys are going to have, your wigs are going to go, wow. Remember the old comedy shows from the 70s? The wig would go, wow. They plan to plunder the wealth of everyone who has positive asset wealth. In other words, their assets exceed their debt. And they want to do a one-time global tax of 10%, stealing that wealth from them in a confiscatory manner to then turn it over to governments to help pay off their debt. Holy smoke-a-lolies. To me, that is so far down the road to communism, it's past communism. All right, we'll be right back. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on the web at americasvoicenow.org. Send me email to mike@americasvoicenow.org. That's mike@americasvoicenow.org. Tell me what you think about this particular episode we just did. We'll be right back.